Welcome to this tutorial, where I will show you how to bake your own ColorID maps, and use them to create 3 example materials. We will cover how to bake ColorID maps for meshes with unique textures. For this tutorial I will be using one of my guns that you can find in the marketplace, the V100 pistol. It's a good example because we have a lot of separate parts and both skeletal and static meshes. I need to export all the parts that have the same texture. In most cases you can just look at the default material to find out which texture it's using. You can also look at the UV channel of the mesh. Note that channel 0 is the correct one. If I open another part of this gun, you can see that its UVs fill exactly the empty space of the previous mesh we checked. This means that they share the same textures. If you want to see the UV map for the skeletal mesh, go to the Character tab and find it under Advanced. I will show you how to export both skeletal and static meshes. The process is the same, but there are some small differences when we import both into Blender. I will export the main body of the weapon using skeletal mesh, and other parts using static meshes. To export the skeletal mesh, right-click on it in the content browser, find the Asset Actions and select Export. Choose where to save the file. In the Export settings, uncheck everything and click Export. Now I will repeat the same process for all the static meshes of the weapon. I won't export bullets or fiber sticks, as both have separate materials from the weapon. Note that I also skip export of the main body, as I already exported it using skeletal mesh. Again, uncheck everything and click Export. Repeat process for all the parts. Once done, open the Blender. I'm not going to make a detailed tutorial on how to use Blender, we'll just cover the basics you need to get the job done. If you're interested in learning more, click on the shown link for one of the many tutorials you can find on YouTube. OK, under New File, press General to start with an empty project. You will start with the default object, which is the cube. You can zoom in and out using your scroll wheel. Hold it down to orbit around the object. Hold Shift and the scroll wheel together to pan the scene. You can also use the gizmo in the top right corner of the viewport to position the camera at certain side. You can select objects in the 3D view by left-clicking on them, or by using the collection panel in the top right-hand corner. This is where all your objects are listed. It's a bit like layers in Photoshop. Before we import our models, we need to clear the scene. To delete an object, select it and press the Delete key on your keyboard. Remove all 3 objects. Now go to File in the top left-hand corner, and click Import, FBX. First select our exported skeletal mesh. In the Properties panel on the right, leave all the default settings except Animations, uncheck it. The object will now appear in the 3D scene of your project. You will need to manually position the camera to see it, or you can press Del on the numeric keypad while the object is selected, to focus the camera on it. As well as the mesh, Blender also imported the skeleton. We select it by clicking on one of those big triangles and pressing Delete to get rid of it. This will change the scale of the object, but we will get to that in a moment. For now, we need to delete the materials assigned to this object. Go to the Properties panel on the right and click on the second icon from the bottom, represented by a red sphere. Now click on the material name and then on a minus sign to remove it from the mesh. We can also remove the remains of the skeleton by selecting it from the Collection panel. Remove the object with the icon that looks like a slingshot. Now let's import all of our static meshes, just as we did with the skeletal mesh. It looks like nothing has changed, but if you look at the Collection panel, we have added new objects to the scene. They are invisible because they are much smaller than our skeletal mesh. If you select one of the new objects and focus the camera on it, you will see that it sits inside the skeletal mesh. We need to match the scale of our skeletal mesh with our static meshes. Select Skeletal Mesh and press N to open Transform panel. Change all three scale values to match the scale of other objects. In my example, 0.1 was not enough, so I changed the scale to 0.01. The scale is fine now, but it looks like I imported one static mesh too many. I imported the pistol slide, but it was already in the skeletal mesh. You can press G and move the mouse to move the object, and press Escape to cancel the operation and return the object to its original position. You can also hide objects by clicking on a little eye icon in the collection panel. I do this to have a clear view of the objects underneath our skeletal mesh, and to make sure I select the right object before deleting it. In this case, our pistol slide. Now let's delete the materials in all our objects. Sites have more materials, but we're not going to export that mesh back into the engine, so you can remove all the materials without worrying. Once this is done, we need to create new materials for our ColorID masks. Select our main mesh and click New in the Materials panel to add a new material to this object. Double-click on it to rename it. Then click on the white bar next to the base color and select the green color from the wheel. Now switch to RGB mode and move the sliders so that green is 1 but blue and red are 0. Precision is important here, otherwise our mask won't be accurate. Now click on the plus icon to add new material and repeat the process for the blue, red and black colors as shown on the screen. Now we can start masking our object, but first let's isolate it to make it easier to work with. When the object is selected, press the question mark key to hide all other objects. Press Tab to enter the edit mode. Here we can work with the vertices, edges, and faces of our object. Press the 3 key to go into face mode. You can also click on the icon at the top. Now we are going to select parts of our object and apply colors to them. To make life easier, we can select whole parts that are not connected to others, such as the pistol grip. Move the cursor over the part you want to select and press L. Expand the new panel in the bottom left corner and select Normal. Our selection has grown, but still not all the faces of your grip are selected. In my case, this is only happening with the skeletal meshes, but we can easily fix this. Here you can see how this type of face selection works on static meshes. We select a face of the magazine body, press L and the whole part is now selected. Select our object, go into Edit mode and press 1 for Vertex mode. Now press A to select all vertices. Now go to Mesh, Clean Up, Merge by Distance. In the new window in the bottom left corner, enter an extremely low value as shown on the screen. If the value is too high like 0.1, it can break our mesh. Something strange has happened to our object, but it's just a shading error. We can fix this by going to the Data panel, Geometry Data and clicking Clear Custom Split Normals Data. If we now move the cursor over our pistol grip and press L with the Normals option selected, we can see that the whole part has been correctly selected. We are now ready to start masking our object. To do this, select part of the object, choose Material from the Materials panel on the right, and click the Assign button. Nothing has changed because we need to change the viewport shading to see the materials. Click on the button shown on the screen. Our mesh is now completely green, the first color is always applied to the whole object. Now the creative part begins. It's very common to mirror some parts of the mesh, like this magazine release button. If I apply different colors to both, I will still end up with the same color on them after I bake the texture. You can find out which part is original and which is mirrored in the UV Editing tab. Select a part with L, and go to UV Editing at the top of the screen. The original part will be included in the light gray rectangle area. The mirrored part will be outside this area, either above, or to the right of it. You are not restricted to selecting whole parts of your mesh. You can also select faces by holding down the Shift key and clicking on them. You can also easily select looped parts. Click on one end and then on the other end while holding Ctrl. When you are finished, press Tab to exit edit mode. Press ? key to exit isolation. Then select the next object, isolate it and add a new material by clicking the plus icon in the Materials panel. You don't need to add all 4 materials, just the ones you want to use. In edit mode, press C to paint a selection. You can also hide selected faces to see what's behind them by pressing H. To unhide, press Alt and H together. Once all the objects have colors applied to them, we need to create an empty texture to which we will later bake our ColorID. Go to the UV Editing tab and click on the New button at the top. Enter the name of the texture and choose the resolution. For this tutorial I will use 2K, which is more than enough. The bigger the texture, the longer it will take to bake. But if the texture is too big, you can always downscale it in Unreal Engine. The last thing to do is to uncheck the alpha parameter. Now that your main object is selected, go to the Shading tab at the top. Select one of our color materials, move the mouse to the dark gray area and press Shift+A. Select Texture, Image Texture, a new graph will appear, left-click to place it. Now click on the small image icon and select your newly created texture. Now left-click on the graph, copy it with Ctrl+C. Select another color material from the right panel and paste it into the same window as the original. Repeat this for all the materials. Back in Layout mode, go to the Render tab on the right. For Render Engine, select Cycles. You can change the rendering device from CPU to GPU if you wish. Bake properties are at the bottom. For bake type, select Diffuse. For contributions, select Color Only. Make sure you uncheck Clear Image, otherwise your texture will be erased when you bake each object. Last thing is margin. For 1K texture I recommend 8 pixels, for 2K 16 pixels and for 4K 32 pixels. Finally click Bake. This may take few minutes depending on the texture size, how many objects you have and how fast your computer is. The progress bar will appear at the bottom of the screen. When the bake is finished, go to the UV Edit tab and select your texture from the list if it's not visible. If the bake is fine, click Image, Save As. You can leave all settings at default, just make sure that RGB is selected in the color. We could stop here and import our ColorID texture into Unreal Engine, but I want to show you how to mask parts of the mesh that are created on normal maps. First we need to export the normal map of the mesh from Unreal Engine. As you can see, it's very similar to exporting meshes. In GIMP, go to File, Open as Layers. Select both the normal map and the baked ColorID texture. My normal map is at 4K resolution, so I need to scale it down to match my ColorID texture. In the Layers panel on the right, select Normal Map and from the top bar, select Layer, Scale Layer. Now I move my normal map layer below the ColorID layer. I use the opacity slider on my ColorID to see details of the normal map underneath. You can zoom in and out by holding Ctrl and using the scroll wheel. Now we need to create a new layer to paint our mask on. In the Layers panel, click on the Create New Layer button at the bottom. Select this layer and find the detail on the normal map that you want to mask. I want to mask the pins on the main body of the gun, so I will use the Ellipse Select tool from the panel on the top left. I click and hold in the center of the pin, hold Shift to have the same scale in both axes and hold Ctrl to make the selection from the center. Now select the Bucket Fill tool. Below I can change the color, but I want the pins to be on a black mask, so I leave the default color. I click a few times inside the selected area to fill it. It can be difficult to find out where some details are on a 2D texture. We can use Blender to help us with this problem. Select all your objects with A, and switch to Edit mode with Tab. Now select all faces with A. Go to the UV Edit tab where you should see all your selected faces. Select UV, Export UV Layout from the top bar. You can change the opacity if you like, but 0.25 is fine. Now import this as a new layer in GIMP, and now we can see the exact shape of each of the UV parts. If we go back to Blender with the UV editor open, we can select part of the mesh, see its position and shape in the UV editor, and use it to find it in the GIMP. When you have finished masking in GIMP, make sure that only the original ColorID texture and your masking layer are visible. Go to File, Export As. You can leave the default settings here. Import our ColorID texture into Unreal Engine, double-click on it and find the compression settings, change it to masks. Once you have added Colorizer to your project, go to the Materials folder and create a new instance material of the Colorizer material. Here we need to add the textures of our mesh. You can also turn off the RMA mode if you don't use this workflow. I will use my skeletal mesh to preview the material I will be working on. In the Material Properties, check Use ColorID and load the texture in the new available slot that has appeared. Let's create a gold pistol with a silver grip and manipulators. I will start by working on the red mask, which is responsible for the main body of the gun. First, I will change the color to gold. Next, I will increase the metalness value to the maximum and do the opposite to the roughness value to make the pistol very shiny. I can also use the color intensity slider to make slight changes, but I decided to keep the original value. Next is the green mask, which is responsible for our plastic grip. I changed the color to white and increased the metalness value to give it a silver look. Because this part is non-metallic on the original texture, changing the metalness value doesn't affect it by default. When something is non-metallic, its value is 0 and we can't multiply anything by that value. So to get around this, I need to uncheck metallic multiply. Finally, I decided to change the color to blue. Next, we have the blue mask, which is responsible for some of the manipulators on the weapon. Similar to the red mask, I used color, metalness, and roughness to give these parts a silver look. The last one is the black mask. I decided not to work on it, so the barrel, pins, and screws will keep their original black color. Later I applied new material to all the parts in my gun blueprint to see how all the parts look with new material. For the second material, we create the Vietnam camouflage with brown handle and manipulators. Again, I started with the red mask and changed the color to white, so that when I apply the texture it will keep its original color. As you can see, we have very visible seams on the gun. To fix this, select Use Triplanar, reload the texture and adjust the tiling. I experimented a bit with the optional normal map and RMA textures I have for this gun. I increased the texture intensity and decreased the metalness value. I increased the smoothness value to get a sharper and more visible transition between the planes. Then I used the rotation and offset properties for the planes to give a more seamless look. For the grip, I experimented a bit with the color, but ended up with brown. Increased the intensity a bit and increased the roughness for a less shiny look. For the manipulators, I decided to give them a similar look to the grip. The main difference is that these parts are metallic, so I had to reduce this value. And for the black mask, I gave it the same look as the main body of the pistol. For the last material, let's create a navy splinter camouflage. For the red mask, I used the previous values as a starting point. I changed the texture and its intensity and also adjusted the position of the triplanar planes to get a seamless look. When working with the texture on the grip, we can choose between a blurred transition in the center or a sharp one. Neither is great, so I decided not to use triplanar in this case. Most of the grip texture is in one piece on the UV map, so we can have a continuous look without using triplanar. In this case it looks even better. For the manipulators I tried to copy the blue color from the camouflage pattern. I decreased the metalness value and increased the roughness to get a more painted look. Finally, I left the black mask untouched.